This last chapter is about the concepts of internal and external validity. So let's start with the first one, internal validity. Basically what this means, it is the issues that are relevant to the specific study in question, meaning your study if you're conducting one. All that internal validity means is that you have the evidence that something you did, and this is an important clause in the study, caused what you observed to happen. You did something to an experimental group that you didn't do to a control group. Something happened, and you could say because something happened, there was an end result of that. What you don't know, without some pretty serious work, is it doesn't tell you whether what you did for the program was what you wanted to do, or whether what you observed was what you wanted to observe. Those are construct validity, and this is an example of validity in relation to whether or not something does what it says it's supposed to. For example, for measuring the construct belonging, whether or not the survey that we use actually measures the idea of belonging accurately. Well, that's related to, in a broader sense, to this whole thing about if you do something with a group of students to increase their sense of belonging and you measure that before and after, not only does your survey have to accurately measure whether or not the sense of belonging is correct, you also have to be able to ensure that exactly what you did caused a change and not something else. So let's look at an example. It's possible to have internal validity in a study and not have construct validity. So for example, let's say we have a study where we're looking at the effects of new computerized tutoring on math performance. And imagine for a second that the tutoring is unique in that it has a heavy computer game component, and you think that that's what will really work to improve math performance. Finally, imagine for a second you're wrong. It turns out that the math performance did improve, and it was because of something you did, but it has nothing to do with the computer program. That's the hard part of trying to figure out, is it just that I did something to them, or was it my computer program in particular? So what caused the improvement is the attention that the child was given, the individual attention that the adult tutor gave to the child, not the computer program that made the difference. So in this example, we have internal validity because we did something with the students. It did result in an improvement in performance, but it wasn't what we thought it was. It was something else. And trying to control for that, to determine whether or not it's this or this, it really is a challenge to do in educational research. So the study would have validity, internal validity, because something that you did affected something that you observed. You did cause something to happen. But the study would not have construct validity, specifically the label of computer math program does not accurately describe the actual cause. It may be personal adult attention. So the key issue in internal validity is a causal one, and this requires a controlled experiment. So if you remember back at the beginning of this semester, I talked about how hard it is to really know something. And you can only really know something in education by conducting an experiment and collecting evidence and trying to control for all the other issues that might have caused influence. Well, now we're circling back around to the beginning of that. So after everything that we've talked about, it really comes down to that, is how do we know it was what we did and not something else? And there's a long list of issues that contribute to poor internal validity in your law book. For example, John Henry effect, compensatory rivalry, history, maturation. How do you know that it's not one of those things that's causing the change that you've implemented versus something else? That requires a controlled experiment. So the other issue that's really important to us is external validity. And this is related to generalization. And that's really is what you need to be able to take away from this. It's the degree to which the conclusions in your study would hold for other persons and other places and at other times. Because if what you did for a experiment only work for that group of people in that place in that time, then the value that that has is very little, because you can't replicate it again. You can't do it with another group of students. You can't do it in another setting. It won't work again the next time around that you do it, because that's at a different time. It's an explanation of how you might be wrong in making a generalization. For instance, you conclude that the results of your study, which is done in a specific place with a certain type of people at a specific time, can be generalized to another context in another place with slightly different people at a slightly later time. That's the threat. And because if you can't do this, then what you've done has little value, because it'll never happen again. So the three major threats are people, place, and time. These are the ways that you could be wrong. Your critics could come along, for example, and argue that the results of your study are due to the unusual type of people who were in the study. They could argue that it might only work because of the unusual place you did the study. Perhaps you did your educational study in a college town with lots of high-achieving, educationally oriented kids. If you don't control for that, if you don't have a broad sample that represents more than just a very specific, narrowly defined population, we can't possibly know that. While they might suggest that your study that you did was at a peculiar time. So there's an example here about a smoking cessation study the week after the Surgeon General issues the well-publicized results of the latest smoking and cancer studies. You might get a different results than if you had done it the week before, because it makes people pay attention to what's going on. The other example that I often provide is I want you to think back about 9/11. If you were conducting a study about patriotism, whether you did that study on September 1st versus October 1st is going to make a huge difference, because there's a difference in the place, or there's a difference in time because of another event that happened. Another example that we talked about recently was measuring students into belonging. And when you do that, when do they feel connected to school? Simply picking the beginning of the year versus the middle of the year versus the end of the year are going to give you different results, because the beginning of the year, you're likely going to get people that are excited about being back at school. They've been away from each other for a long time. At the end of the year, everybody tends to be fed up. They're tired of being there. The teachers are tired of being there. The students are tired of being there. So it tends to be about the middle of the year. And if you're going to do it again, you have to make sure you do it again at the same time. Otherwise, somebody could go back and say, well, it's only because of the time period that you picked. And I think that that runs true for issues with teacher perceptions. Their perception of their job at the beginning of the school year is really different than the end of the school year, even if you're measuring the same perceptions. You kind of get a middle ground by doing it in the middle of the year, and really right before Christmas break, between Thanksgiving and Christmas. Things tend to be fairly normalized. If you try to do a research study right now in the middle of testing, nobody's happy about school right now. It's just the way that it is. Those are all issues of external validity. So how can we improve that? Sampling. The better job that you can do, and remember we talked about sampling a couple of weeks ago, better job that you can do with sampling and making your sample look like your population as much as you possibly can. It eliminates the people and the place issues. Also, including something called proximal similarity. If you can do a better job of describing the ways your context and other different issues about providing lots of data about the degree of similarity between various groups, people, places, and even times, if you can provide evidence that, yes, you may be doing this in Northwest ISD, but Northwest ISD looks like A, B, C, D, and E. And there's these other districts that look like Northwest in terms of A, B, C, and D. It is trying to connect your people in their place in that time context to somewhere else. That takes one, you doing a good job with your sampling, and two, you doing a good job of describing the situation that you're in. So when you actually go through your dissertation practice, one of the things that you'll have to provide is some context about your sample group. That has to be robust because you don't want to put yourself in a position somebody could come along and say, well, it wasn't what you did, it was that particular time or place. So I've got a couple of exercises for you to go through. I'll put those in a Google Sheet and give you about a week to work on those.